All right, so picture this. You're the Home Secretary, standing in the Commons, suit pressed, briefing folder ready, about to unveil your grand migration reforms. You're expecting the usual parliamentary theater, a bit of heckling, maybe someone falling asleep on the back benches. Standard Tuesday, yeah? But then a liberal Democrat accuses you of stoking division with your language, and suddenly you're not reading from your notes anymore. You're telling the entire chamber, and by extension the entire country, that you get called a f***ing Paki on the street, that you're regularly told to go back home, in your own country, as the Home Secretary. And just like that, what was supposed to be a policy announcement becomes one of the most visceral, uncomfortable, and frankly explosive moments we've seen in Westminster this year. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, and buckle up because today we're unpacking Shabana Mahmood's absolute scorcher of a Commons clash, the migration reforms that sparked it, and why this whole thing is a masterclass in how immigration debates in Britain have become so toxic they're literally poisoning our politicians in broad daylight. So let's set the scene properly. Yesterday evening, Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood stood up to present Labour's new asylum reforms. Now, these aren't minor tweaks. We're talking about making asylum seekers contribute to their own accommodation costs, tightening the criteria for who qualifies for protection, basically a whole toolkit designed to make Britain less attractive to people trying to cross the channel in dinghies. The government's pitch? Our asylum system is too generous compared to our European neighbors. It's pulling people toward our shores, and British taxpayers are footing a bill that feels increasingly unfair. Mahmood even went there with the language. She said the pace and scale of migration has destabilized communities and is making Britain a more divided place. Strong words. Deliberately strong words. The kind that make opposition MPs shift uncomfortably in their seats. Enter Max Wilkinson, the Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesman, who clearly decided he wasn't having any of it. Wilkinson stood up and essentially told Mahmood she was out of line. Not for the policies themselves, mind you, but for her language. He accused her of claiming that the country is being torn apart by immigration, and said that while acknowledging challenges is fine, stoking division by using immoderate language is quite another. He called the government's plans cruel state-sponsored robbery and insisted they wouldn't fix anything. Classic Lib Dem stuff, right? Principled opposition, bit of moral grandstanding, defend the vulnerable, make the government look mean. Textbook. But here's where it gets absolutely mental, because Mahmood didn't do what politicians normally do when accused of inflammatory rhetoric. She didn't deflect to statistics, didn't hide behind what the British people really want, didn't pivot to attacking the Lib Dems' voting record. No, she went personal. She went visceral. She looked at Wilkinson and said, I'm paraphrasing slightly for flow here, I wish I had the privilege of walking around this country without seeing the division that migration creates. Unlike you, I'm the one who gets called a f***ing Paki and told to go back home. I'm the one who knows, through personal experience and that of my constituents, just how divisive asylum has become. And then she said it's incumbent on every MP to acknowledge how broken the system is and make fixing it a moral mission. Now, let's just pause there for a second. The Home Secretary of the United Kingdom just told Parliament that she experiences racist abuse regularly. Not occasionally, not once in a blue moon, regularly. She's a cabinet minister, second in command on national security, and she can't walk down a British street without someone hurling racial slurs at her. And she said this not as a sob story, not fishing for sympathy, but as evidence, as proof that Wilkinson's accusation of her stoking division completely misses the point. The division is already there. It's already happening. It's happening to her personally. This is where the whole thing becomes uncomfortable for everyone involved, because Mahmood is basically saying, don't lecture me about inflammatory language when I'm living the consequences of this debate every single day. You think my words are divisive? Try being the target of the division that already exists. It's a power move, no question, but it's also deeply revealing about the state of British politics right now. Immigration isn't an abstract policy debate anymore. It's personal, it's visceral, and it's getting nasty. And here's the thing that makes this even more complicated. Mahmood is using her experience of racism to defend policies that many on the left think are themselves pandering to anti-immigrant sentiment. She's saying, essentially, I face racism, I understand the division, and that's precisely why we need tougher asylum rules. It's a rhetorical judo move that's genuinely hard to counter. How do you tell someone who faces racial abuse that they're the one being divisive? How do you separate legitimate criticism of harsh asylum policies from the implication that you're dismissing her lived experience? It's a complete minefield. Now, let's talk about what Mahmood is actually proposing, because the policies themselves are what triggered this whole clash. The headline measure is making asylum seekers contribute toward their accommodation costs. Currently, if you're an asylum seeker in the UK, you get housed and you receive about 49 quid a week in financial support. Mahmood wants to change that. She wants people to chip in if they've got savings or assets. The government's argument is that this is about fairness and contribution, not about leaving people destitute. Mahmood explicitly said, "We're not saying we'll take everything away and leave people destitute, but contribution is a fair principle." Sounds reasonable on the surface, right? Except here's the reality check. Most asylum seekers arrive with basically nothing. They fled persecution, war, disaster. They're not exactly rolling up with bulging savings accounts. The ones who do have resources are a tiny minority. So this policy is either going to affect hardly anyone, in which case, why bother, or it's going to be used as a backdoor way to make the asylum process even more hostile and bureaucratic. Wilkinson called it state-sponsored robbery, and while that's melodramatic, his underlying point isn't completely daft. If you're fleeing for your life and Britain offers you sanctuary, is it really fair to then present you with a bill? It starts feeling less like refuge and more like a budget hotel with terrible reviews. The broader package includes tightening asylum criteria, speeding up removals, and making the whole system less attractive to people considering the journey. Mahmood's logic is straightforward. Britain's asylum offer is more generous than most of Europe, so people are specifically aiming for the UK. If we make it tougher, fewer people will come, and we'll reduce the strain on the system and on community cohesion. It's deterrence theory applied to asylum policy. The problem, deterrence only works if people have genuine alternatives, and most people risking their lives in the Channel aren't exactly weighing up their options over a spreadsheet. They're desperate. Deterrence assumes rational calculation in situations where people are often far beyond that point. But here's where Mahmood's argument gets interesting, and this is why she went nuclear in that exchange with Wilkinson. She's arguing that the current system is itself creating division, that because the system feels out of control to voters, because communities are struggling to integrate new arrivals, because the numbers feel overwhelming, the backlash is getting worse. And in that environment, she, as a British Muslim woman of Pakistani heritage, becomes a target. She's saying the status quo isn't sustainable because it's feeding the very racism she experiences. Therefore, tough reforms aren't pandering to racists, they're actually necessary to drain the poison from the debate. It's a hell of an argument. It's also one that makes a lot of progressives extremely uncomfortable, because it sounds dangerously close to "we must appease the anti-immigrant crowd to make them less racist," which historically has never actually worked. The reaction in the Commons was telling. Labour backbenchers are already grumbling. Some think Mahmood is going too far, too fast. They remember the lessons of the Blair and Brown years when Labour tried to out-tough the Tories on immigration and ended up legitimizing UKIP instead of neutralizing them. They worry that harsh rhetoric and harsh policies don't reduce division, they normalize it. They make it acceptable. They shift the Overton window so far right that suddenly we're having debates about whether asylum seekers deserve basic support. On the upslide, there are Labour MPs, especially in former red wall seats, who think Mahmood isn't going far enough, that voters are still angry, still feel unheard, and still think the government is too soft on illegal migration. And then there's the Lib Dems, who've positioned themselves as the conscience of the Commons on this issue. Wilkinson's intervention was classic Lib Dem positioning. We're the party that still believes in compassion, in international obligations, in treating vulnerable people with dignity. The problem for the Lib Dems is they don't have to govern. They don't have to stand in front of voters in Stoke or Sunderland and defend why the asylum system is overloaded. They get to occupy the moral high ground without facing the electoral consequences. That's not a criticism exactly. Opposition parties are supposed to oppose, but it does make their criticisms easier to dismiss. Mahmood can say, "You've got the privilege of not dealing with this," and she's not entirely wrong. What makes this whole episode so revealing is how it exposes the gap between Westminster rhetoric and lived experience. Wilkinson accused Mahmood of using inflammatory language, and she responded by saying the inflammation already exists in the streets, in her daily life, in the abuse she receives. It's a reminder that for politicians from minority backgrounds, immigration debates aren't academic exercises. They're personal. Every policy decision, every speech, every soundbite has real-world consequences for how they're treated in public. Mahmood is making policy while simultaneously being targeted by the exact forces that policy is supposedly addressing. That's a level of complexity most MPs don't have to navigate. And yet, there's still something deeply uncomfortable about a Home Secretary using her experience of racism to defend policies that many anti-racism campaigners think are fundamentally unjust. It creates this weird paradox where Mahmood can say, "I face racism, so I know we need tougher asylum rules," and critics are left struggling to respond without sounding like they're dismissing her experience.